They tore through the silk drapes, crimson staining the pillars like blood on marble. A child's wail pierced the courtyard, half agony, half disbelief. He knelt before an emperor, draped in purple, trembling under the weight of imperial decree. But why was this boy weeping? What crime had he committed? The answer is more grotesque than any tale you've ever heard. Imagine a throne room turned surgical theater, blades glinting under torchlight. A boy, not yet a man, laid bare by the world's most feared ruler. Nero, the mad sovereign of Rome, gazed upon his lifeless wife and saw not grief, but opportunity. He wanted to recreate her monster that he was, and cruelly selected this child as his vessel. Why would an emperor beloved once for his arts and patronage sink into such depravity? How could power twist a man's soul until he butchered innocence itself? Tonight we uncover a chapter of Roman history so dark, so unfathomable, it defies belief. Who was this boy? What fate awaited him after the deed was done? And what does it reveal about the man who ordered it? Brace yourself. This story is unlike anything you've heard. The Roman world of the mid-1st century AD was a realm of staggering contrasts and precarious power. From the marble-paved streets of the Forum to the vaulted halls of imperial palaces, every corner of the empire sang with the glory of conquest and the whisper of conspiracy. Vast armies secured distant frontiers, while senators and equestrians in Rome's teeming neighborhoods vied for influence beneath the ever-watchful eyes of palace spies. Yet for all its grandeur, the throne of the emperor sat upon a bed of shifting alliances. One misstep, one whispered accusation, and a man born to rule could find himself cast into the shadows, or worse. When Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, ascended at just 17, the weight of empire pressed down upon him before he had known the touch of full manhood. Adopted by his great uncle, the aging Emperor Claudius Nero had been groomed in every art of statecraft and every secret passageway of palace intrigue. He observed behind silk curtains and stifled laughter how poison and betrayal moved with the same inevitability as Roman legions crossing rivers. In those early days, his mind drank in lessons of ruthless pragmatism. His heart, as yet unscarred, believed the trappings of power would keep him safe. Roman society itself was a tinderbox of tension. On one side stood the senatorial elite, proud families living in opulent villas atop the Palatine Hill. On the other, crowds of plebeians crammed into insulae, each tenement rising like a tower of whispered discontent. Meanwhile, the ancient gods of Rome maintained their hold in the temples, even as foreign cults and the growing stirrings of a new faith from Judea undermined old certainties. In public, Nero adopted the mantle of traditional piety. In private, he hosted Greek poets and philosophic debates, long into the night flirting with ideas that some whispered were dangerously un-Roman. At the heart of the imperial drama was Poppaea Sabina, a woman of both commanding beauty and subtle ambition. Born into the upper ranks of the aristocracy, she moved through the corridors of power like a noble predator, drawing admirers and enemies in equal measure. When Poppaea captured Nero's eye, their union seemed destined for legend. Lavish banquets held in her honor, poems penned to celebrate her wit, monuments planned to immortalize her grace. Yet beneath every gilded moment lurked jealousy, both within the court and within Nero himself. Advisors fell silent at her approach. Old friendships withered under her glare. Then came the tragedy that would shatter the illusion. In the winter of AD 65, while Poppaea carried their first child, rumor tells of an argument in the imperial bedchamber. Some chroniclers claimed Nero, in a sudden rage, struck her with such force that miscarriage and death followed within hours. Others insisted it was a cruel accident in the heat of passion. Whatever the truth, Poppaea's life ended abruptly, and with it died the last vestige of gentleness in Nero's reign. Grief morphed into something darker, not remorse, but an obsession with erasing his loss. Around the same time, the empire trembled at its edges. In Britannia, legions struggled against fierce tribes. In Judea, unrest fed on religious fervor. Senators scrubbed their hands with more than oils when debating grain levies and border defense. In Rome's shadow-draped corridors, alliances were struck in whispered oaths. Spies swept through the streets, gathering every scrap of rumor. Into that maelstrom stepped an emperor undone by sorrow, his judgment clouded by a longing to restore what he had lost. It was amid this gathering storm of political intrigue and military challenge that Nero conceived the unthinkable. Unable to accept Poppaea's finality, he envisioned a grotesque rebirth, an echo of his beloved in the body of another. He needed a child, someone unconnected to the Claudian line, pliable and faceless. From the teeming masses of Rome, he would pluck his chosen instrument, a boy whose very innocence would heighten the horror of what was to come. If power could transfigure history, he would remake life itself. And so, as embassies reported uprisings on distant frontiers and conspirators within Rome sharpened their daggers, Nero turned his gaze to this mysterious child. The young victim, yet unaware of the fate decreed by imperial command, stood at the threshold of a nightmare woven by grief and tyranny. Through the cold corridors of the palace, orders passed like poison through the veins of the court. Before the head of an empire, an atrocity was set to unfold that would eclipse every whispered scandal and blood-stained dagger known to history. From this moment of mounting peril and unholy resolve, the story accelerates toward its grim apex. The boy's journey into the heart of darkness is about to begin, and with it, the empire's shadow will grow ever longer. The moment the boy crossed the threshold of the imperial palace, the air around him seemed to shift, as though the very stones of Rome trembled at his presence. He had been summoned in secret, plucked from his modest home by imperious guards who issued no explanation and hurried through winding corridors lit only by flickering torches. Each stride brought him closer to a fate he could neither imagine nor resist, and with every footfall, the walls seemed to whisper rumors of blood and power. Inside the chamber of state, heavy tapestries muffled the echo of his small, uneven footsteps. Senators in dark togas sat in semicircles, their faces grave, their eyes flickering with both fear and anticipation. At the head of the room, Nero reclined upon his dais, draped in robes of deepest purple. His gaze was cold. There was no pity in those eyes, only the inscrutable hunger of a man ensnared by grief and madness. Behind him, Poppaea's marble likeness glowed in the torchlight, her gentle features frozen in eternal repose. Approach, Nero commanded his voice, as smooth and merciless as sharpened obsidian. The boy obeyed each juvenile heartbeat, echoing like a drum in his chest. The distance between them closed until he stood just before the emperor's feet. All around him, the assembled court fell silent, as though at the brink of witnessing some dreadful rite. A hush fell so complete It felt as though the world itself held its breath. Nero leaned forward, inspecting the child as a jeweler might examine a flawless gem. His lips curved in a faint, terrible smile. "You have been chosen," he said softly, the words slicing through the silence like a knife. "Chosen to become her." Those 3 words, her likeness, her memory, gambled with the boy's mind, yet he could not comprehend their full weight. In that moment, time itself seemed to slow. The courtiers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, some with horror, some with morbid curiosity. The boy closed his eyes, praying for deliverance, but found none. From the shadows stepped a man whose presence sent a ripple of recognition through the court. Epaphroditus, Nero's most trusted freedman, the man who had once soothed the emperor's temper and consoled his grief. He carried in one hand a length of fine linen, unstained pure, as if never soiled by sin. He offered it to Nero with a reverent bow. The linen, the courtiers knew, was destined to be the tool of the boy's defilement. A murmur rose at Nero's feet, so faint it might have been the sigh of the palace itself, before dying into silence once more. As Epaphroditus presented the cloth, Nero extended a slender finger, motioning the boy to step aside. The child's legs trembled beneath him. He looked to the door, to the faces of the senators, for some spark of mercy, but no hand reached for his, no kindly word graced his ears. At that instant, an undercurrent of conspiracy swelled through the hall. A faction of senators had already begun to question Nero's decisions, to doubt the wisdom of an emperor so consumed by personal tragedy that he would desecrate innocence to assuage his own torment. Tiberius Pollio, a senior senator known for his discretion, leaned toward Lucius Pedanius, his fellow conspirator, and whispered a fragment of a plan, documents ready, messengers poised to carry proof of Nero's cruelty beyond the city, beyond the empire itself. But Nero, ever attuned to the subtlest shift in the atmosphere, flattened his gaze upon Pollio. In that glare lay both warning and menace. Speak another word, and the boy's blood would deepen the stain on Rome's marble floors. Pollio froze, his whispered counsel snuffed out like a lamp in a suffocating room. The emperor stood regal and damning. "Prepare him," he said to the attendants. Their nod was mechanical, haunted. 2 guards seized the boy's arms, guiding him toward a small table set with instruments arrayed like a butcher's tools, a curved scalpel, forceps, dozens of needles, and lengths of thread that gleamed like silver filaments. The soldiers cast down the linen, and Epaphroditus laid out the fine blades with ceremonial care, as though sanctifying each piece. The boy's cries filled the chamber. They surged and ebbed, cries of a spirit being torn from body and reason. Some senators looked away, disgust searing their hearts, while others watched with a cataclysmic fascination, as though drawn by a terrible gravity, powerless to look elsewhere. The walls hung with portraits of Rome's ancestors, and war heroes seemed suddenly complicit, their painted eyes condemning the atrocity. In the first strokes of steel, the boy's world fractured forever. He struggled valiantly, but the guards held him powerless. His raw screams echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, a symphony of innocence, bleeding out on imperial orders. For Nero, this was a ritual of rebirth, each cut designed to reshape flesh, each stitch meant to sculpt a living effigy of Poppaea. Yet even as the deed commenced, contestors within the palace seized their moment. In a secluded gallery adjacent to the chamber, a cadre of conspirators gathered swiftly. They bore the blood-stained cloth, hidden inside a velvet pouch, and scrolls detailing every vicious step of the operation. Led by Pollio and Pedanius, they were prepared to confront Nero directly, even if it meant risking their lives. At the same time, outside the palace walls, clandestine messengers moved through the night, carrying news of the emperor's atrocity to the Licinian Gate, where Rome's slaves and freedmen gathered. A spark of outrage ignited among the populace. Rumors spread like wildfire through the winding alleys. The emperor has butchered a boy to replace his wife. Though they dared not gather in open revolt, whispers turned into mutterings of vengeance. Inside the chamber, halfway through the barbaric procedure, the boy's body lay still for a moment, broken by pain beyond all measure. His eyes glazed, mirroring the cold resolve of the emperor above. Nero bent low, whispering words meant only for the boy's ears, words of longing, of obsession, of a twisted hope for rekindled love. But the boy could not hear, his senses drowned in a flood of agony. Suddenly, an uproar in the gallery, a clash of armor, a chant of defiance. The conspirators had burst through the door, brandishing the stain-soaked cloth in one hand and the incriminating scrolls in the other. "Stop this abomination." Pollio's voice rang out, carried by courage and righteous fury. "This child is no puppet. He is Rome's innocent soul, for one heart-stopping instant time stalled." The emperor straightened crimson droplets, still fresh upon his robes. He released the boy, whose body slumped to the floor, unconscious. Guards surged to form a barrier between Nero and the conspirators. Tiberius Pollio stood his ground, breathing hard, the bloodied linen unfurled like a flag of revolt. Nero's lips twisted into a bitter grin. "You call this abomination?" he hissed, advancing with imperial menace. "It is art. It is love. It is the only way I can hold Poppeia's memory alive." His voice, mellifluous yet poisonous, slithered through the chamber. "If you condemn me for demonstrating grief, then you condemn the very essence of humanity." A hush fell shattered by the boy's sudden groan. He blinked, chest-heaving awareness, a flickering back like a candle in the dark. His gaze found the cloth in Pollio's hand, and then the emperor's face. Something primal stirred in him, a dawning comprehension of injustice. Pain surged anew, but beneath it burned a quiet ember of defiance. That ember leapt into flame when a young guard, once a friend of the boy, in simpler days, lunged forward, seizing the cloth from Pollio and tucking it beneath his armor. In that gesture, he pledged secret allegiance to righteousness over tyranny. Others followed suit. Whispers of insurrection rippled through the ranks. Nero's expression grew hard fury, eclipsing fascination. "So, traitors," he thundered, "you stand with this child over the emperor who built this empire, then you choose your fate." Guards hesitated, torn between loyalty to Rome's institutions and loyalty to the man who wore its crown. The conspirators seized their opening. Lucius Pedanius unfurled the scrolls, reciting, "Here is proof of your monstrous plan. Caesar names, dates, witness testimonies. The Senate will act. The people will rise." In the charged silence that followed, the walls themselves seemed to shudder, as if listening. Then, with a single terrifying motion, Nero raised his hand. A hidden signal. Trumpets blared in the courtyard beyond. A detachment of Praetorian guards stormed in swords drawn. The chamber convulsed into chaos. Senators scrambled to protect the conspirators, but the Praetorians were relentless. Steel flashed. Shouts echoed. The boy, still trembling, crawled toward the stained linen, desperate to cling to his only hope. In that instant, Nero's face softened with a semblance of sorrow, or was it delight? No one could tell. Steel met flesh. Pollio fell, clutching his side. Pedanius shouted curses as a blade forced him back. The senators, realizing their peril, melted into the shadows. Only the praetorians remained their loyalty absolute. With grim efficiency, they secured the cloth and the scrolls, tossing them into a brazier at the chamber's edge. Flames licked the edges of priceless scrolls, devouring the evidence. As smoke curled toward the vaulted ceiling, Nero swept forward, his robes swirling like a vengeful storm. He knelt by the boy, lifting him roughly into his arms. The child's eyes met his, and for a moment fear gave way to pity, but then the pity vanished, replaced by a cold edict. "You belong to me now," Nero whispered. "Your will, your flesh, your life, it all belongs to me." The praetorians formed a protective ring, shepherding Nero and the boy from the chamber before any fresh dissent could ignite. Senators slunk back to their seats, stunned and wounded in spirit. The chamber's hush settled once more, but now it was laced with dread. The emperor had silenced rebellion, but in doing so he had shown the depth of his cruelty. Outside, the city stirred. Rumors of flames at the palace spread. Word of the boy's rescue of the cloth. A handful of loyalists, calling themselves the Iron Quill, kindled hope among the oppressed. Messengers fled toward the Senate, toward the temples, bearing whispers of treason and atrocity. Yet the praetorians, loyal to Nero above all, had seized the city gates. No news could pass without their sanction. Within the palace walls, the boy was concealed in a hidden wing, tended by obedient physicians who sewed his wounds with trembling hands. Meanwhile, Nero retired to his private apartments, staring into the polished obsidian mirror where Poppeia's statue seemed to watch him wearily. In that cold reflection, he glimpsed his own monstrosity. But rather than recoiling, his lips curved in a satisfied smile. He had shown Rome the lengths to which he would go, and no one had dared challenge him successfully. By dawn, the boy lay in fevered sleep, his body broken, but his spirit quietly alight with newfound purpose. In unguarded moments, he murmured the name Poppaea as though invoking a lost mother. Elsewhere, hidden hands pressed the charred scrolls between layers of wax seals, preserving what little remained. And below the palace, in tunnels known only to a few conspirators, pledged anew to bring Nero's tyranny to an end. From the imperial heights to the cobblestone alleys of Rome, the stage was set for the next cruelest act. The boy's transformation would proceed, and with it the empire's descent into a tragedy of unfathomable scale. Yet far beyond the marble columns, the seeds of rebellion had been sown, and soon the consequences of Nero's darkest design would erupt in unprecedented fury. Thus, as first light crept across the city's rooftops, Rome awoke to a new dread, the reign of a mad emperor, armed with both razor and will, and a helpless child at his mercy. And so the rising conflict hurtled toward its gruesome crescendo, where loyalty, betrayal, and vengeance would clash in an unstoppable storm. The chamber had fallen into a grim stillness, as though the stones themselves recoiled from what had transpired. In the dim light of dawn, broken fragments of wax from the consumed scrolls clung to the draperies, their acrid scent mingling with the coppery tang of blood. The boy lay motionless upon the marble slab, his small frame a haunting testament to the violence inflicted in Nero's name. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, the echo of a life teetering on the edge of oblivion. Epaphroditus knelt beside him, his trembling fingers brushing back damp strands of the boy's hair to reveal the jagged scar that arced across his abdomen. Each stitch, placed in the tyranny of the night before, had been intended to reshape flesh into the semblance of Poppæa's form. But at what cost? The boy's pale skin, torn and stitched, had lost its innocence. It bore the Emperor's obsession like a brand. In his chest, a faint glimmer of life remained, and with it a spark of defiance that no blade could fully sever. Outside the chamber, the conspirators huddled in fearful anticipation. Tiberius Pollio, his robes stained with the ashes of the charred evidence, pressed his ear against the heavy oak door. He could hear the boy's ragged breathing, each rasp like the final bars of a funeral hymn. Lucius Pedanius, kneeling beside him, whispered, "His time draws near. We must act before he slips away entirely." But in the hush that followed, the conspirators realized that Nero's reach extended into every corridor. No secret passage was safe, no sympathizer truly loyal. Within the palace's hidden depths, the boy's captors debated mercy in hushed, agonized tones. A physician, once a healer of gladiators' wounds, pressed cool cloths to the boy's forehead, murmuring prayers to forgotten gods. He examined the mangled tissue with a horror that mirrored the court's. Nearby, a nursemaid wept softly, her tears falling onto the boy's exposed shoulder. "He is dying in agony," she sobbed. "Nero will have our heads when he learns we showed compassion." Yet even as fear gripped their hearts, they dared not abandon the child to certain death. Word of the boy's fate had reached the common quarters of Rome before the first light. In crowded alleys near the Subura, whispers erupted into anguished cries. "They've slain a child," one voice lamented. "Not for treason, not for honor, but for a madman's vanity." Mothers pressed scarlet handkerchiefs to their mouths, trying to muffle the grief that threatened to spill into the streets. The city, so accustomed to cruelty in the amphitheater, found this atrocity beyond bearing an emperor warping flesh for his own solace. Back in the imperial mausoleum, Nero lingered by the boy's side, his shadow stretching across the stone floor like a blot of ink. He watched the boy's chest, willing it to rise with vigor, longing for the rebirth of Poppæa's spirit. His breath came uneven, as though even he feared this moment of reckoning. Awake, he murmured, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "Rise," as she did, renewed. Yet the boy's eyes remained half-closed, glazed with pain, and the haze of opiates meant to dull his senses. A distant clang echoed through the corridors, the signal that the Praetorian Guard, alerted by Nero's summons, had begun the day's patrols. Their boots rang against the marble like the ticking of a relentless clock. Nero's attendants, loyal to a fault, prepared the emperor's bath candles and robes for the morning ceremony. The ritual demanded that Nero present himself before the people as though nothing had transpired, an image of divine composure. But behind the facade, nightmares churned visions of a boy's bloodied flesh, the hush of witnesses unable to cry out. The conspirators resolved to strike before the sun fully rose. Seizing Pollio's cloak, they slipped from their hiding place in the gallery, passing through deserted antechambers to the inner sanctum. Their plan was desperate reach. The emperor seize him before he could don his ceremonial mask and demand justice in the name of Rome itself. Blades were hidden beneath togas, and each man carried the weight of countless innocents on his conscience. Each footstep felt like a drumbeat, signaling the approach of doom. They found the Emperor at the threshold of his private bathwater, already heated steam curling in plumes around his ankles. He stood bare-chested, blood still staining his chest and hands, as though the boy's life essence had seeped into his skin. Poppeia's statue loomed behind him, its marble form luminous in the rising sun, a silent judge of every sin committed in her name. Nero turned at the conspirators' approach, his eyes wide with a mixture of indignation and triumph. "You come for me?" He breathed, his voice as cold as the water at his feet. Pollio stepped forward, his cloak drawn aside to reveal the glimmer of concealed steel. "By the ancient laws of Rome, by the blood of innocents you have betrayed, I challenge you, Nero, that this empire may be cleansed." His shout reverberated through the bathroom's tiled walls, splashing arcs of water onto the floor. The water hissed as droplets fell onto the heated stones, mingling with the scent of incense. In that charged moment, the Emperor's composure cracked. Traitor Nero spat his hands and stained with cruelty. He lunged forward, baring teeth in a feral snarl. "Art lives beyond your petty laws." But the conspirators were prepared. Pedanius vaulted from the shadows, his sword arcing toward Nero's side. The blade caught the Emperor's tunic, tearing but not piercing. Nero reeled back, fury scorching his gaze. He raised his hand, summoning the Praetorians with a single gesture. Their rush was thunderous shields, and bayonets clashed, drenching the marble in chaos. From the threshold, the boy stirred. He had overheard the commotion and dragged himself upright, each movement an agony. He cried out, voice raw, "Stop!" But the sound was swallowed by the tumult. Amid the clamor, a Praetorian tripped over the boy's fragile frame, pinning him beneath a boot. A scream cut through the melee, a woman's, and two guards sprang to pull the boy to safety. They laid him on a folding cot, tearing their cloaks into bandages for his wounds. In the center of the carnage, Nero and his challengers clashed in a vortex of steel and blood. The Emperor fought like a cornered beast, his strength fueled by rage and desperation. Pollio, wounded in the arm, parried Nero's strike and countered with a glancing blow to the ribs. Nero staggered but recovered, eyes blazing. Then above the roar, a new cry rang out to the boy. "Protect him." A young centurion, moved by compassion, rallied half the guards to form a living shield around the cot. As the conspirators fell back, trapped between their desire for justice and the Emperor's unyielding guard, the boy watched with tears streaking down his bruised face. He clutched the bloodied cloth to his chest, the one shred of proof that might one day shatter Nero's tyranny. In that moment, his agony transmuted into resolve. Though his body was broken, his spirit had been tempered in flames of injustice. He raised trembling hands and cried, "Rome, remember the words stretched through the hall, cutting through steel and shield." Guards hesitated, torn between orders and conscience. Some lowered their weapons, discomfort etched into their faces. But the Praetorians, bound by oath, tightened their ring, pressing in on the boy's protectors. Nero, seizing the moment, rushed toward the cot, intent on snatching back the cloth. A centurion stepped before him, sword leveled. "Not by imperial will," he declared, voice unsteady, "by Rome's justice." The clash that followed was swift and brutal, metal against metal, a testament to a fractured empire. In the turmoil, the boy's cot careened into a column, sending him sprawling onto the hard floor. He cried out in pain, clutching the cloth to his chest as though it were a shield against oblivion. Above him, the last conspirator fell struck down by Praetorian steel. Nero sheathed his dagger chest, heaving blood splattered across his breast. He took a step toward the boy face contorted. "You will not take her from me." His voice was both command and lament. He surged forward only to catch sight of his own reflection in a polished bronze panel. For a heartbeat time stilled. In the gleam of metal, Nero saw himself as others might a tyrant, stained with the blood of a child, an emperor dethroned by his own atrocity. The world held its breath as he trembled, caught between the raw power he wielded and the monstrous image staring back at him. Then with a guttural roar, he struck the panel with his fist, shattering it into jagged fragments. The shards fell like stars onto the marble floor, cutting his hand. Blood welled from the wounds, mingling with the boy's spilled tears. In that moment of madness, Nero whirled and fled, leaving behind a scene of ruin, the broken column, the overturned cot, and the boy clinging to the cloth eyes, alight with pain and defiance. Silence settled like a shroud. Only the boy's labored breathing broke the stillness. Epaphroditus crept forward, gathering the shards of broken bronze, collecting each splinter as though preserving a relic of conscience. Nurses and guards tended the boy's wounds, their faces etched with sorrow and shame. The echo of battle drifted away, replaced by the drip of blood onto cold stone, a solemn requiem for innocence lost. Beyond the palace walls, distant bells told the hour and hour that marked both tragedy and change. Rome, in its slumbering grandeur, trembled at the edge of dawn, unaware that within its heart, an empire's darkest deed had just reached its horrific climax. And in a hidden alcove, the boy, his body shattered, his spirit aflame, pressed the blood-stained cloth to his lips and vowed, "I will remember for you." Thus ended the tragedy of flesh and empire, a death that was not a single moment, but a cascade of broken promises and shattered lives. And as the first rays of sunlight pierced the eastern windows, they illuminated more than marble, and blood they revealed the fracture line in Rome's soul, destined to widen in the days ahead. In the days that followed, the palace fell into an eerie hush. Courtiers passed one another in the corridors with downcast eyes, as though each footstep stirred memories too painful to bear. Nero resumed his public duties, adorned in imperial purple and gold, yet the composure he displayed at the theater and the forums carried the hollow ring of someone performing a role rather than ruling with conviction. Whispers trailed behind him like mournful shadows. Rumors of the boy's mutilation mingled with talk of fresh conspiracies, eroding the emperor's once firm hold on the hearts of Rome's citizens. Beyond the marble columns of the palace, the city itself began to reckon with what had occurred. In the marketplaces, vendors paused mid-sale to discuss the atrocity, how the son of no one was cruelly offered up to clothe Nero's grief. In the insula of the poor mothers pressed their infants close, raising glances of fear at passing legions. Even the merchants who dealt in human flesh slaves, captured in distant wars, murmured that they had never heard of such a transaction, a life offered without ransom or sale, merely for a madman's vanity. Some sought to erase the memory entirely. Statues of Poppaea were quietly removed from public spaces, ostensibly for restoration, but never returned. Poets and playwrights who had once celebrated the imperial couple found their works condemned or consigned to dusty libraries. The state annals, when they recorded Poppaea's death, chose sterile language and untimely loss omitting any mention of violence or revenge. Yet these official silences only deepened the public's unease, as if a wound left unspoken festered in the empire's conscience. Meanwhile, beneath the city streets, the thread of resistance held firm. The handful of senators and guards who had refused to burn the blood-stained cloth had secreted it away in the inner sanctum of a temple to Janus a silent promise that one day its stain would be revealed. The boy, now hidden in a remote villa on the outskirts of Ostia, clung to that relic as a talisman. Though his body bore the scars of Nero's designs, his spirit had become a living testament to the cruelty of unchecked power. In that villa's quiet gardens, he grew in secret. Wise tutors, sympathetic physicians, and former gladiators turned guardians taught him Latin and Greek history and strategy healing and rhetoric. They hoped to nurture in him not only knowledge, but the moral clarity required to hold an empire accountable for its darkest deeds. Poppeia's statue, a modest bust rescued from the palace, watched over him, a reminder that even the most exalted lives can be broken by tyranny. Across the Mediterranean, news of the emperor's horrors drifted into the courts of foreign rulers. Parthia's ambassadors in Rome sent coded messages back to their king, warning that Nero's clouded judgment could threaten stability on both sides of the frontier. In the provinces, governors who once marched in the emperor's name now paused, uncertain whether bullets paid in loyalty would secure favor or draw suspicion. Armies on the Danube and in Britannia bristled with unease, their legions long accustomed to civil discord, but shaken by a spectacle so intimate in its brutality. As months passed, the story slipped into legend. Some claimed the boy had perished in the villa, his wounds too grievous for mortal flesh to endure. Others whispered that he had returned to Rome in disguise, appearing amid the populace to testify against the throne. Craftsmen carved Poppeia's likeness on funerary urns alongside queues, the mark for those whose lives were stolen unjustly. In the narrow alleyways of Trastevere, a secret cult revered the boy as a martyr, offering prayers at dusk beneath flickering oil lamps. Yet history, like the Tiber itself, refuses to remain still. Official records omitted the atrocity, but letters and poems hidden in private collections preserved the truth. A single worn parchment, its edges frayed, its ink faded, bore the scrawl of Tiberius Pollio. Remember, the blood of one cleanses an empire's soul only when its stain is revealed. That fragment became the seed for later chroniclers who pieced together the full horror of a ruler's fall from grace. In the end, Nero's name endured alongside tales of gladiatorial games and grand public works, but the story of his darkest hour lingered in whispers. It served as a cautionary echo for emperors to come, that grief unchecked by virtue can warp a man into a monster, that beauty worshipped from afar may become a cruel obsession, and that the vulnerable often bear the scars of power's most depraved whims. And so, as the years slipped by, Poppeia's story lived on, not in marble or manuscript, but in the unyielding memory of those who refused to let silence swallow the truth. The boy, once a vessel for horror, became a symbol of defiance, his life, reminding Rome that even in its greatest splendor, darkness can take root, and that only by remembering can the empire find its way back to justice. As the sun sets on this harrowing tale, we're left with more questions than answers. How does an empire reckon with its own brutality? What becomes of innocence when power corrodes the soul? Nero's reign survived on pageantry and terror, But beneath the gold and marble lay wounds that would never fully heal. Remember the boy's blood not as a footnote in dusty annals, but as a warning etched into history's memory. If you thought this was horrifying, wait until you witness the madness that consumed Caligula the emperor, who turned his palace into a playground of nightmares. Click next to uncover the twisted excesses and ultimate downfall of Rome's most notorious despot. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because in the shadows of empire, the darkest stories are still waiting.